Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Mark and Thomas Chung. They're both founders at Verdigris. Guys, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Kevin.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you guys on the show. I think what you guys are doing is really innovative and cool. But maybe before we get to know Verdigris, let's get to know each one of you a little bit better. So, Mark, why don't you give us a quick overview of yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, and then let's dive in to your career a little bit up until Verdigris, and then Thomas, I'll do the same for you.
Sure. I am Mark. I grew up in Austin, Texas. I think this part will be pretty similar to Thomas.
Considering your brothers.
Our dad was an engineer. So he was always fixing things around the house, fixing cars, fixing stuff. We had like the first computer in like, I don't know, the town that we grew up.
Very cool.
So kind of just seeing a lot of engineering and stuff growing up, and also because we were like the only Chinese kids in a pretty rural area of Texas, we also were kind of both very much into math and science. And I spent a lot of time doing that all the way up until school, where I went to Stanford and studied engineering, and then I went into electrical engineering. Did grad school at Stanford, got my first job at AMD designing chips.
Oh, interesting.
And then went to a startup company called PA Semi, which was later acquired by Apple, again designing microprocessors. Now almost all the phones that that iPhones and the iPads are all based on architecture that I helped work on.
Wow, very cool.
And then right before this company, I worked at a company that went through a couple of different iterations, but it was a startup company that did network packet inspection processing. Eventually, that company, NetLogic, was bought by Broadcom in 2011, I got to see that go all the way from 13 engineers to 800-person company before it was acquired. Then started this company. So that's what I've been up to.
Very cool. Thomas, do you want to give us a bit of background on yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I also grew up in Texas, Mark. Really where in Austin, which was fairly progressive. So, as Mark had said, we grew up as some of the only Asian kids, but really in a pretty welcoming environment, and a lot of Texas hospitality there. So, was very, very sort of happy with that growing up, and later on decided ultimately that I really enjoyed it. Stayed in Texas and went to school there in undergrad. At the University of Texas at Austin, where I ultimately ended up studying computer sciences. So I guess my our family always kind of joked that Mark would sort of take electrical engineering and I would do software.
Why is that? Just out of curiosity.
I think it was potentially some nudging for us to go off and one day build a company that could deliver an integrated product.
Very cool. That's awesome. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
That was maybe the grand design of our parents, perhaps. A little bit.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a master plan in a file cabinet somewhere. But yeah, awesome. Ultimately, after school, Mark said, computer science is that you really should just come to Silicon Valley. There's some really amazing things out here. I ended up, after school, joining this, it's like a Kleiner Sequoia-backed venture company. It was founded by the former or the founder of Electronic Arts. It was called Digital Chocolate at the time.
Right.
So really wanted to sort of understand what the whole Silicon Valley ethos was about. And it was just a tremendous learning and growth experience. And then, from there, ultimately moved on to build a small iPhone development publisher that we later sold to a private equity shop in Los Angeles before I ultimately made the move to Verdigris.
Very cool. So how did you guys come up with the idea for Verdigris, and what exactly is it?
I mean, a lot of it had to do with him at the time kind of going from all of these chip makers and startup companies. And I feel like it was kind of around the time that they had sold, him and our other co-founder John had sold their company NetLogic to Broadcom. Kind of a soul-searching moment where my nephew Emrys was just born, and Mark, I think particularly around that time there was a lot of fascinating but terrifying climate science research coming out, and when thinking about what we were sort of doing with our time, and how he could make the world a better place for his children, that was really kind of how he thought about the direction he wanted to take his career at the time. And when you're in that sort of situation, I think it started out a little bit as the sort of Silicon Valley story, right? We met up in his garage Saturday mornings. Those are some of our fondest pictures, where it's not a Palo Alto garage, but more like a Sunnyvale garage. But sitting there, kind of goofing off in the mornings.
What's the difference for people that don't know?
They're adjacent, or two small cities in the peninsula adjacent from each other. But one is sort of known for being kind of a birthplace of HP and some other fairly well-known Silicon Valley startups like Apple.
Sure.
Startups at the time, and we were not too far away in Sunnyvale.
I would say the biggest difference in my view, Kevin, is that like Sunnyvale is the Palo Alto of like 50 years ago, maybe.
Got you.
Palo Alto now is just full of, if you already have a garage in Palo Alto, you probably have, a successful company.
I see.
In Sunnyvale, homes are much more affordable, and so that's where we started.
Got you. No, very, very cool. So I'm curious though, Mark, how did you originally come up with the idea and then decide to actually go for it and recruit your brother?
Yeah. Okay, so I think Thomas may have already mentioned the part about the motivation to try and do something beneficial for humanity because of, my son was born. It sort of changed things for me. The idea actually came about because there was some experiments that we had been running at work with different kinds of packet inspection technology.
Interesting.
And one of the really interesting papers that I came across was the work of a gentleman named Zico Coulter, who actually turned out to have the same graduate advisor as I did at Stanford.
Oh, wow.
And in his work, he talked about these new techniques, which were very similar to kind of like, at the time it was like at the beginning of machine learning and AI craze. So new techniques to do algorithmic pre-detection of signals. So there was that, and then there was this really high energy bill that I had on my house, and I couldn't figure out where that energy bill was going. And sort of the combination of that generated this idea, like, why don't I just take a very high frequency sample of the electrical data coming off the house and try and run this generic algorithm to see if we can separate all of the information so I can figure out what's causing all of that electricity to go away. And that's when we kind of made this really startling discovery that all of the different equipment in my house was generating very unique signatures that could all be teased apart and picked apart by an algorithm.
Interesting.
I think that was a really interesting discovery. And then, after we found out the problem in my house, I sort of shelved it until later on. I realized, all the technology we have could solve much more meaningful problems. So that's, and then later, after Broadcom bought the company, I think, and my son was born, there was like this kind of a bunch of factors that contributed to like, okay, it's time to take the plunge and build a company. And Thomas and I had toyed around with the idea of, starting a company many times, but we were so in completely different industries. But I knew that I was going to need someone with, his computer science background, his product skills, like his early stage company skills. And it took some convincing because he's like, Mark, this company that I just sold, I'm running their entire digital division now, and got a lot of projects underway. Like, but I think eventually I said, what would make mom and dad happy? What would make
Guilted him into it. I like it.
I guilted him into it. Yeah.
No, that's very cool. All joking aside, so I'm curious then, how did you guys fund the company at first, and how has it evolved and changed into what it is today? Because you guys have been around for about a decade. Is that correct?
Yeah, close to a decade. Since so early days, it was actually seed funding from Thomas and myself and our co-founder John. So the fortunate thing was like both John and I had a reasonable sized exit. Broadcom bought the power company for close to $4 billion.
Wow.
And while we were like early engineers there was enough trickle down effect of that size of an acquisition that we had some money to put into the endeavor.
Nice.
And then Thomas, I think he was one of the co-founders of his last company. So, we got a big check from Uncle Tom.
Awesome.
The original
that's how we got it kicked
founders
off.
are in the room.
We kicked it off. We put our own money behind it. I think it was easier that way in the beginning.
Sure.
And then, quickly, I think we realized we needed some external validation or, smart money behind it too. So we raised some additional funding and then landed at Stanford StartX, which was like an accelerator program at the time.
Very cool.
And through that program, we raised some additional capital.
Got you. So walk us through the 10 years. How is it the same and different from what it was 10 years ago? And obviously doing a hardware software company is really challenging. So do you want to maybe talk about some highs and lows of that journey and what you guys have learned along the way?
Yeah, I mean, the time period was long, and so it's kind of weird to think about how I've spent a decade now, a quarter of my life, and half of my working life on Verdigris. A good portion of that was really just kind of deep R&D. So a lot of the stuff that we were doing at the time, very cutting edge in terms of what we were trying to deliver into the market. How the early parts, I think particularly in the first 5 years, a lot of it was R&D and market discovery. Initially, a lot of the proof points that we had of what we could do was sort of in a residential setting because that's where the lab was. So, asking around and finding that these were really problems of much more significant magnitude in commercial facilities. Those were learnings that we took, and then figuring out how to convince someone to let us, essentially test on these large commercial facilities, like at the Moscone Center or things like that. It took us a little bit of time to learn what we had to learn to have the credibility to essentially go in and run those projects. So those were a lot of the early days. It was a lot of really just talking to a lot of people, trying to get the technology stable, working, and so ultimately, it wasn't until I think 2017 when we had the broadly commercially available versions of our product that we could deploy sort of globally anywhere, and began to scale the sales and marketing efforts.
Got you. So, sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious, how did you land some of those early adopters that you go in and try your technology in there? Because the Moscone Center is one of the biggest conference centers in San Francisco. Is that correct? That's correct, right?
Yeah. It's I think it's funny because as an early team, we were sort of proud of our academic credentials and our work experience, but what I think really drives people to make a decision like, hey, I'm going to let this startup touch some of the electrical infrastructure in my building. They really got to have a problem that they think you can help them with. And it was just like a really hungry industry for a solution to a problem.
Well, you're potentially saving them a ton of money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And they didn't really have the visibility at the time to sort of understand where all that money was being spent or where that energy was going.
Got you. So walk us through, how does a company or a hotel or a building actually implement the technology? Because you guys have some huge, well-known companies and clients using your hardware and software.
Yeah. It's a fairly straightforward process today. I mean, at the time it was a little bit bumpier, but today there are some fairly standard packages that we would provide to our customers. So I'll talk about the experience of one of them.
Sure.
Just another one in San Francisco, since I'm thinking of it and they're nearby, which is the Grand Hyatt over in Union Square.
Sure.
It was fairly straightforward. We would deploy the metering, the Verdigris metering at their primary mechanical, so their HVAC and sort of the electrical feeds going into the building. And the key reasons we're doing that were to capture one, sort of all of the entire building footprint, because we're looking for essentially everything you're getting billed on. And then two was sort of the HVAC, or the things that were really controllable. And once we've done that, then it was a matter of just integrating with their building management system, so we have a point of actuation. So those things combined, we essentially had the visibility that to the data. Once all that data is getting pulled into our cloud, everything else is sort of hidden from the customer. On our end, we're building our forecast models, we're building our control models, how we're going to optimize the building, and a month later, we go to the customer. We say, you know what? Here's how much you're going to save if you use Verdigris, and here's a portal to all of your data, so you can see it working in real time. You have that transparency, so you know that it's trustable. You know that it's not going to mess things up for your occupants. And this is what you're going to save if you turn this on. Do you want to do it? And then we flip the switch and we go. And then they have an autonomous building running after that.
Interesting. Okay. Very cool. So when I log into my account and I start seeing this stuff, Is it real time? Is it delayed? Walk us through what I can kind of see and how real time it is or isn't.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on, Mark.
No, sure. I can say there's kind of like a few different workflows that a building owner cares about. So there is obviously a real-time view, which our systems they're cloud connected. They're always generating data, and that data is always streaming continuously into the cloud.
Gotcha.
So you can log in, you can see things in real time. I mean, those things tend to be for like spot fixing problems. So if we see an alarm, like I'll point to an early example, like a bunch of people in a Netflix building were plugging in space heaters because it was cold, and it would come up and it would trigger an alarm that this was going to overcurrent the breakers and cause a shutdown of that floor. So in real time, the facilities manager could log in and see, oh, okay, someone just plugged in a space heater, and I know exactly when it was plugged in and those types of things. So there's kind of this real-time view that handles some of the things that they might have in their workflow.
Very cool.
But we noticed that, it's not just so much for a lot of these guys. They're so busy all the time that they don't have time to just kind of sit in front of a dashboard and look at this stuff. So we developed a couple ways to push this information out. We give them a weekly report on an email that will tell them all the events that happen. Here are some of the insights that we've discovered. Here are the things that we see as problems. And then we went, like Thomas was illustrating for Hyatt, we kind of went one step further, which was because those reports get boring after a period of time, just seeing all these problems that I haven't been able to get to and I haven't solved. We automate the building for them, so the report that we give them is, here's how many events that we automated. Here's how much each of those events saved you, and here's what the system is doing for you. And so it's sort of like a more hands-free approach to the solution today.
Got you. Okay. Okay. No, that's cool. So how, I get it would depend on the size of the building or where you're actually implementing the system, but roughly how long can it take? And do you have to be a trained electrician to install it, I'm assuming, or walk us through that?
Yes. This goes back to your earlier question about hardware versus software.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger challenges we have is that there is a system to install.
Right.
I mean, so early days, I think we were really thinking, hey, how do we just get the data, provide all this analytics, do some automation just as a software layer? And it's pretty tough to get the right kind of data. So we do have a system. Normally, a customer, when they want to place an order with us, as an example, they'll send us an electrical drawing of their building.
Okay.
And that electric drawing has a bunch of information on it, like where the sensors should be deployed and installed. Our team will scan through that, produce a custom configuration of sensors, kind of like if you're going to like the Apple store and picking off the configuration of your MacBook.
Right.
We have to do some lightweight configuration of the system. They order it. Our fulfillment center will deliver it within, say, 48 hours, depending if it's in the U.S. We schedule an install window. Typically, it's designed to be self-installable. So a facility that's sophisticated enough will have people on staff that can do the installation. If they don't, then they can call in. They can call in for an electrician, or they can contact us, and we can do a concierge installation, and we will provide an electrician to do the installation.
Gotcha.
It doesn't necessarily require one, but it's always good to have someone who's like kind of skilled with installing meters. And then they go in. The difference between what we do that's and like what maybe a legacy offering or a legacy meter might have is that ours is like connected to the cloud from startup. So when you turn it on, you power it on, a Wi-Fi hotspot comes up, you pair it with your phone, you can map all the Wi-Fi, you can do all the configuration and setup, if you like, some of our enterprise customers prefer to do this like at scale. So you can just get us all the configuration information on a spreadsheet, install those systems, and then our team will load all that stuff into the data system.
Okay.
And then, within an hour or two, everything is on and configured. Then it's running, and then we're just collecting information at that point.
Gotcha.
Yeah. If you've ever sort of had the experience of setting up like a Nest or a Google Home or something like that, it's essentially, really borrowing a lot of those modern design paradigms and applying them to commercial space.
Sure. So like pretty easy then to do.
Yeah, it's meant to be self-installed.
Sure. No, that's very cool. I think a lot of people these days have installed a Nest or a Google Home or other similar kind of smart home things that connects to the home. And it's actually, they're not complicated at all as somebody that's actually done it. And at first I thought it was kind of daunting. And then when I did it, you're just like, oh, this was actually really easy. So
yeah,
very cool. So I'm curious to know some maybe other examples, or where do you guys take it from here? Because obviously with the pandemic, most people have been working at home. So walk us through how you've helped buildings throughout the pandemic and kind of after the pandemic, and once maybe some people start returning actually to physical offices and other spaces.
Yeah, the pandemic was sort of interesting. It had a really bimodal effect on our business. One of sort of the key verticals for us was the hospitality industry, and so
sure,
as you can imagine, that changed pretty dramatically when COVID, when lockdown started. But I wouldn't say it was foresight, but it turns out that COVID had sort of the opposite effect on a lot of other industries where Verdigris does have a lot of customers. And so particularly for data centers or logistics, where you were seeing a lot more e-commerce activity, we were hearing from our contacts at Verizon, T-Mobile, these guys, that their traffic that they were seeing, back in April of 2020 was essentially the same that you would get if you were, Christmas time.
Wow.
And, that was just kind of the level of video, audio, wireless traffic going back and forth. And it only grew from there. Most people were kind of saying it took most online business 5 years into the future. So a significant growth opportunity for Verdigris at the same time. And then, going forward, I think as a lot of these businesses are thinking like, well, how do we reopen? How do we get back to work? What does a new workplace look like? I think a lot of what we've been hearing from our customers is that they're not expecting things to be the same by any means, but are looking to create spaces that can match how dynamic the work environment should be to support unknown number of people or different types of meeting spaces, different types of use cases. And really it's funny because it's sort of a facility operator's worst nightmare to not know how the building is going to be used. But it's something that I think software can be extraordinarily good at in terms of being able to adapt in real time to sort of emerging behaviors in a building.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. So you kind of touched on it earlier, but I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on it. About predicting, like you mentioned with Netflix, like they know if you're going to blow the breaker or something because too many heaters are plugged in. But what other types of things can you help or notify somebody on staff that might happen or needs maintenance or something like that? Can you walk us through some examples of that?
Yeah, there's tons of examples of them, but some of them are a little bit boring. Like we do have examples like in large factories where they are getting hit by really heavy demand charges. We had one of our earlier clients that was a large consumer electronics manufacturer globally. They had these massive energy bills that were coming from the movement of electronic goods through what's called a thermal cycling oven. So as they were cooking equipment through these thermal cycling ovens, they weren't staging them. They were just kind of going through super high heat ovens and then moving them through. And what they found, or what we were able to find, was that if they just staged them correctly, they never hit the peak that was costing them like 30-40% of their energy bill. And the throughput was the same. They just had to pipeline it. So that was, a pretty interesting discovery. Another interesting early discovery that we had was that a customer had been walking through and doing security sweeps. This is in a 24/7 facility. Okay. Overnight, as they were like running their security sweeps, they had this weird procedure where they would just turn on all the lights all throughout the entire facility. And then as they security sweep a section, they would shut down the light. And then they would security sweep another section and shut down the lights. And they would do this, and the whole sweep would take like 12 hours overnight. Wow. And meanwhile, like 80% of the lights were on for that entire time when they were just needing to like identify a single location. And so they made a simple correction, and you could see it like the really pronounced inflection point of like their overnight energy usage dropped by like 2/3.
Wow.
So there's lots of little interesting things that happen all the time within these facilities.
Sure, I can imagine. Is there anything that, like, do you guys, if there's like a disaster or something, can you guys send a push notification to somebody to say like, look, this thing just like, needs to be replaced or needs maintenance, or can you do preventative maintenance? How does that kind of stuff work?
This is a sensitive area. Maybe Thomas, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely working on sort of classifying severity. I would say, one of the steps we were trying to get to before you're going to send somebody an SMS in the middle of the night, you kind of have to have a really, strong sense that that's something that's super urgent for them to go look at. And it usually can't be something like, hey, I'm not seeing power on this circuit. Generally you only want to look at that sort of thing if it's a really big deal. And it turns out that particularly in a post-COVID world, and I would say the modern workplace, that what is a quote unquote big deal is it actually depends on who you're asking. If you're asking the person at the facility who their job is to make sure these things don't break, kind of everything's kind of a big deal.
Right.
But if you're talking about a business unit leader who runs 50 or 100 of these buildings, it's got to be orders of magnitude larger before you send that person a text message.
Sure.
So part of what we did as the step before that is we were trying to figure out, like, is there a better paradigm for how people get alerted to these types of issues that doesn't require that they know all these intimate details about the building, particularly if they're running these businesses from thousands of miles away. And that's kind of one of the benefits of having a lot of this technology and software and having this AI, is because you can sort of figure out what normal looks like for the building. And then instead of saying, hey, if the energy goes up, drops under some kilowatt, hey, you know what, just send me a notification if this is going to have more than like a $10,000 impact or $100,000 impact. And then our AI engine will figure out, how often is that happening, about like, that's going to look something like 3 or 4 alerts per month. You get to make that decision on what that noise threshold is. And what we found was that people really love this idea, because what normally happens today is if you do try to set that kind of alarming, it gets noisy really, really fast. So figuring out how to get, only the important stuff in front of you, that was the bigger thing for us. And the workflow today is currently through email, through email for most people, although we'll set up, for SMS for the people who are sort of the 24/7 on call.
Got you. Okay. No, that's very cool. So I'm curious to know, how often do you guys have to release actual new hardware and iterate on the hardware, or can you do majority of your updates just through software?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's definitely evolved over time. I think early on, the platform was pretty unstable, and we had to do a lot of tight design cycles to iterate on the hardware to get it to a kind of a stable point.
Right.
I think I call it the kind of like the prototyping phase, where we were,
Sure.
where we were in Moscone and we were sitting there with a laptop debugging issues, and then we iterated. We had to build a new set of boards and quickly go through that. We went through that cycle probably for 6 generations of the hardware.
Got you.
And probably at 3 to 6 month design cycles. But this last generation, between Gen 5 and Gen 6, we took a lot more time between them, because Gen 5 was relatively stable, had some issues. Gen 6 has been pretty robust, and so I think all of the fixes that we've had to do, in the field or in adding more capability, has all been firmware, and we've taken an approach of being very, Tesla-like, if you want to say it there. We sort of future-proof the hardware.
Gotcha.
So it has plenty of processing capability. It has really great firmware upgrade. We can remote update the firmware. It has all of the bandwidth and the speed that we need to continuously update improvements to it. So now the kind of entire network of hardware out there can be upgraded just with the push of a firmware upgrade button. And we'll probably do another hardware revision maybe in a year. And mostly that will be to just deal with the kind of issues that crop up when you have like tens of thousands of systems in the field.
Got you.
Yeah. And I would add to that, maybe just cost reduction. And part of what we've been trying to do in each generation of hardware, part of our cultural value, and one of the reasons we founded Verdigris, was really to have this impact. And to that end, our goal is really to make this as accessible as possible. So all of the real expense behind this kind of metering equipment for equipment and labor that went into it for generations, like we're really trying to eliminate all those costs. So in the future, when we do another hardware rev, I think our goal is to bring that to larger and larger audiences.
Very cool. So you guys have been doing hardware and software for a long time now, iterated a few times, built a bunch of prototypes. Is there any advice that you would give to people that are doing a hardware and software startup that maybe you wish you knew when you were earlier on in the game, or when you've been doing it for a number of years?
Oh, there's too many lessons for a short podcast. My best advice for anyone trying to do a company, in some cases, like our market, we couldn't get around the fact that we needed to build our own hardware. But if you can find a way to do that and have your goods be virtual, electrons are way easier to distribute and sell and move and manufacture than atoms. which have logistical issues, manufacturing issues, capital issues. There's so many things that we didn't realize, go into the cost of manufacturing and distributing and installing your own equipment. And, the time that it takes you actually have to put cash into these pieces of equipment before you can sell them. So there's all sorts of issues about how much capital you need to raise. All I can say is that if we had it to do all over again, I would probably still do the hardware, but we would probably be a lot more thoughtful about some of these other issues that came about only after you move from the prototype phase to like trying to actually productionize and deploy hardware. It's really hard.
Yeah, and mine would be, every dollar or hour we put into a customer conversation, in hindsight, just paid itself back 100x. Being engineers by training, that was probably the steepest learning curve, at least for me, in terms of what it really takes to put yourself in front of a customer, really put yourself in their shoes for a day, and sort of even be able to ask questions in the right way to really get to the root of what's bugging them. And that information, when it worked well, like I just know I can look back on some of the previous design decisions we made in hardware or software and what kind of assumptions we were making about the problems we were solving. And in a lot of cases, we were great. I'm glad we're still around today. Man, in some cases, those were painful lessons.
Sure. No, I think that's actually really good advice. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about you guys and any other links you want to mention?
Yeah, our website is verdigris.co. That's probably the best place to find information. And verdigris.co. There's no M at the end. If you have, if you have listeners who are interested in our solution and and deploying it in their facilities, that's the best place to find out about it. Find out about the benefits of it and how to get it, and contact our sales. And if you're interested in maybe joining our team and have listeners that want to help us with what we're trying to do, that's also a great place for a list of careers. And obviously we're still rapidly growing and trying to hire strong people to join our team. So that's another, I'll put the plug out for that as well.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and throw out my personal email. It's just Thomas, THOMAS @verdigris.co. So I'm heavily involved with our growth team. We'd love to hear from people just to know how we can potentially help them with their problems.
Very cool.
And, you could probably already guess what my email is, given Thomas spelled his out. But I'll just say that you can also just send all questions to me to Thomas.
Perfect. Well, guys, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks,
Kevin.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good one.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.